We're now on Daf Tesvav Amid Beis, and we're trying to figure out under what conditions can you eat meat according to Rabbi Meir that was slaughtered on Shabbos unintentionally. That's only, says the Gemara, that on Erev Shabbos you already knew that you would have to shech this meat because you have a chola in front of you, and this ill person is critically ill. So therefore, there's no muktzah over here because already on Erev Shabbos, he anticipated shechting on Shabbos and eating the meat. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Ihachi, my time of the Rabbi Yehuda the Osar. If we're talking about a case of Hoyel Chola B'Bod Yom, why would Rabbi Yehuda be machmir in such a case? I mean, there's no, there's no Isur. You shecht something for a pikuach nefesh, he's allowed to eat it, and there's no muksa because already on Erev Shabbos he knew that this critically ill person would need fresh meat. So the Gemara says, what happened was, although with this person who was a chola, and therefore you'd be allowed to slaughter the meat for him, he was critically ill, but hivri, during the course of Shabbos, he recovered. And therefore, you no longer have a pikuach nefesh situation because he recovered, and you can't shecht it on Shabbos, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir debate whether the meat can be eaten if the animal was b'shogeg shechted. There's no muktzah over here because at that moment of Bein Hashmoshos entering into Shabbos, he had a chola who was critically ill, so he anticipated that he would have to shecht the animal. Okay, so now let's just summarize. According to Rav, he could not tolerate that brisa who reflected the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and according to Rav, misrepresented Rabbi Meir. Because the Bala brisa had assumed that Rabbi Meir would be mekil even in shchita, when in fact, Rabbi Meir was only mekil in the case of cooking. You could always anticipate cooking, but who's going to anticipate slaughtering an animal? If a person shechts an animal on Shabbos for the sake of somebody who's critically ill, asur lebari, only that person that is critically ill, that patient is allowed to eat the meat, but no one else is allowed to eat the meat. And the reason for this is because the person was healthy on Erev Shabbos, so there was a muktzah issue. So that's as far as shchita is concerned. But we said in Bishul, he can anticipate on Erev Shabbos that it'll have to be mevashel. And therefore, we have the statement in the name of Rav that a mevashel lechola b'Shabbos mutal lebari. My timer, because even before he cooked it, he could have eaten it raw. Haroy lakus. But in the case of meat that was slaughtered, you can't swallow raw meat. Haya in haroy lakus. And therefore the meat is muksa. Rav Papa, you know what? Rav Papa says that's not so clear that you can't chew on meat. Pamim shashochet mutter, kigon shahoyelo cholim b'vod yom, mevashel asur. So, in the case of hoyelo cholim b'vod yom, he anticipates that he'll have to do the shechita, and therefore you're allowed to eat the meat. It's not muktzah. But as far as bishul is concerned, we said it's even more muchan, because he can chew it raw. Mavashal also gon shekotzatz lo delas. In other words, he had something that was growing from the ground, a gourd, and he cuts it on Shabbos. So it was mechuber lekarka when you entered into Shabbos ben hashmashos erev Shabbos, and therefore it's muktzah, because you can't detach it on Shabbos. That's meleches tolish. So we're going to paskin hashochet lechol b'Shabbos mutal lebari bi'umtza. Right? It's possible, says Rav Dimi, that you can eat raw meat without cooking. And therefore, if there was no muktzah, because he already had an Erev Shabbos, a chola, critically ill, then we're going to allow a healthy person to chew the meat raw, my timer, came with the efshel kizais possible shchita, ki kashachit, adaiti the chola kashachit. Right? It's obvious that you can't eat even an olive's volume of meat without first shechting it. And therefore, when he shechted it for the purpose of the chola. However, in the case of a mavashel lechola b'Shabbos, also lebari, because maybe if you allow him, he may add more to the cooking pot. In the case of shechita, there's one act of shechita, no matter how much meat you're going to eat. But in the case of cooking, you add the ingredients up to a certain volume. And now if we're going to allow you to, and you're a bari to eat it, then you know what? Maybe we should add something to the pot. And there's no heter v'chol nefesh, of pikuach nefesh, for that which you added to the pot. Okay, this leads us to the Mishnah here of Tolush and Mechubar. Hashochet b'magal yad b'tzar u'b'kana shchitasa val is ksher. Right, you can slaughter with the blade of a hand sickle, with a sharpened piece of flint. That's called a tsar. And with a reed, you sharpen the reed and you shecht it. Everything is fine. But hakol shochtin uli olam shochtin bakol shochtin. We don't know exactly what the Mishnah is saying over here. The Gemara is going to have to go through each piece by piece. Chutz mimagal kotzir, right? There's a harvesting sickle and a magero, which is a saw. V'hashinayim vatziporim. Right, so shinayim means animal teeth, and tziporin is nail. Mipnei shehem chonkim. Right, they don't cut, but they strangle. So now the Gemara is medayik in the language of the Mishnah. It says hashochet, etc., etc. What does that mean? Do you have it in lichatchilo? It doesn't say mutar lishchot. It says hashochet. You're allowed to eat from the meat. Bishlei magal yad. I can understand why lichatchila we don't want you to use a hand sickle because dilma asil mebad be'idoch gisa. There are two sides to the sickle. Right? There's the sharp side, the cutting side. And then there's the other side, which is called serrated. And that you're not allowed to use for shechita. So l'chatchila we'd rather avoid the sickle because we're afraid lest he turns it to the serrated side, and that would be a pasul shechita. But el etzur v'kana l'chatchila lo, why not? Why can't you use a reed or a flint, Ramini, I'll prove to you that the opposite is true. You're allowed to use it because by kol shochtim, the Brisa says that you could use anything in shecht. And shochtim means even lechatchila. Bein b'tzar, bein b'zchuchis, bein b'krumis shel kana, right? Flint, glass, the stem of a reed. The only thing we have to exclude is a magal yad, a hand sickle. But in any event, clearly from this price, a kol shochta means it's even lechatchila permissible. Yet our Mishnah seems to assume that lechatchila it's not proper to do it this way. Lo kasha kan b'tolosh kan b'mechubar. This introduces a great sugya, massive sugya, to differentiate between that which is detached and that which is growing from the ground, attached to the ground. We cannot use something that's attached to the ground for shchita. I don't know why. I tried to figure that out. I couldn't figure it out. Tiyomer Rav Kahana shoche b'mechubel karka, Rebbe posel Rav Chia machshir. Okay, now it seems that according to Rav Chia, you can consider this shchita as valid. Ad kan lo ka machshir Rav Chia ela b'di'evet aval chatchila lo. In other words, in a case of mechubel karka, Rabbi Chia says that although l'chatchila you're not allowed to do it, but b'di'evet is fine. So what did Rabbi Chia say about shochim b'mechubel karka? He said machshir. Machshir means that although l'chatchila you're not allowed to do it this way because it's mechubel karka, but b'di'evet it's okay. And that, says the Gemara, is going to reflect our Mishnah that says hashochet, which we understood meticulously as b'di'evet and not l'chatchila. That's going to reflect the shita of Rab Chia with regard to something that's mechubar. Fact the Gemara b'mayu kim to Rabbi Chia u'di'evet elahad sanya. What do we do with the following brisa? The brisa says bakol shochatim. Bein b'tolish, bein b'mechubar. So you see that even though it's mechubar and it's attached to the ground, you're allowed l'chatchila to use it for shchita purposes. Bein shasakin l'mayla, v'atzara bein l'mala, l'mato. That's the classic case where the knife is above. Or bein, here's a fluky case, shasakin l'mata, v'atzara bein l'mala. So you have the sakin and you place the animal on top of the sakin, right? The neck on top of the animal. Anyway, it's clear from this brisa that you're allowed to use something that's mechubar and even lechatchila mani. Who does that work out with? Who is the author of this brisa? Lo Rebbe, v'lo Rebbe Chia. It can't work out neither according to Rebbe, who says that if you shech with something that's mechubar, it's possible. And it can't even be according to Rebbe Chia, who says that if you shech with something that's mechubar, b'di'evet is kosher. Because he Rebbe Chia di'evet in, lechatchila lo. And yet it says here, bakol shokta. Bakol shokta means lechatchila. And Rabbi Meir, you're really out of the box if you say Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir holds that if you use an instrument that is mechuber, is afilu to the evedlo. Li olam Rabbi Chia. Right? There's no havmin of reconciling this with Rebbe. But if you're like Rabbi Chia, afilu lechatchila. Wait a minute. What do you mean afilu lechatchila? Rabbi Chia, when he debated this issue with Rebbe, they were talking about a case of b'di'evet. Why not tell me a bigger chiddush that according to Rabbi Chia, even l'chatchila it's mutar, like we saw in this price? They only argued in a case of b'di'evet to show you that Rebbe went as far as to pasel shchita b'mechubar, even b'di'evet. But Rebbe Chia himself would be matir lechatchila to use mechuba. V'ela masnisa the ketani hashochet. Now we're in trouble because we've just excluded the middle case, the middle possibility. Either you hold like Rebbe to one extreme and Mechubar is possible, or you hold Rabbi Chia that Mechubar is mutter even lechatchila. What do you do with that Mishnah? Right? Elamasisa the Ketoni Ashochet, and the word Ashochet means the Eved in lechatchila lo. That's only with the Eved. Is money. Who does that work out with? Lo Rebbe, who says that even with the Eved is possible. V'lo Rabbi Chia, who says that even lechatchila it's mutter. I Rabbi Chia afilu lechatchila. I Rabbi the Eved namilo. So what's the Gemara's answer? Li olam Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia says you could shecht an animal with mechubar even lechatchila. Umasnisa the Ketoni Ashochet Ayam Mishnah says Ashochet's b'diavad. That's Rebbe. Now it comes out that Rebbe holds that if you shecht with mechubar, then b'diavad is kosher. In fact, the Gemara kasha the Rebbe had the Rebbe. Right? We had a brisa from Rav Kahana that quotes Rebbe as saying that the shechita is psula if it's mechubar. Amishnah says lechatchila it's also, but b'diavad it's okay. Lo kasha. And here's where it really gets complicated. Kan v'mechubar meikaro, that which was in nature mechubar, like when we talk about stones in a mountain, that the mountain was from the day of Rashis, it was always mechubar. The kan b'tolush, in its natural original state, it was tolush, it was right detached. Ulvasof chibro, and then he attached it. So again, when you're using for shchita a mechubar meikaro, then Rebbe would say, but it's possible, completely possible. However, if it was tolush in its original state, and then you made it into mechubar, then although lechatchila you can't shecht with it, but by the eved, the shchita is a shchita kshera, even according to Rav. What's your source, this shanilan, that you make a distinction between mechubar meikaro and tolush ulbesof chibro? That the real mechubar, the real mechubar is only if it was naturally from and originally mechubar. But if it's now mechubar, but it originally was tolush, that's not mechubar. How do you know such a thing? And Desanya, we learned to the brisa. Okay, you ready for this? Hashochet b'muchni shchitasu kshera. So what you have is, you have water that goes into this wheel and turns the wheel around and around and around. He puts a knife on one level of the wheel, turns around the wheel, and at some point the knife slaughters the animal. And guess what? The shechita is valid. Okay, I don't want to let the cat out of the beans, but that's based on a principle called koch gavra. But for mechubar lekarka, shchitaso. Oh, I'm sorry. Even in mechubar lekarka, shchitaso kshera. Not sakin v'kosel v'shagat, but so now we're talking about something that's meikara, it's tolush. He's got a sakin, but now he attaches the sakin to a wall and it becomes mechubar. Shchitasu kshera. Why? Because even though it's now mechubar, but it wasn't originally mechubar. Hoyetzar yotze mina kosel okana ola me'elav. Me'elav means in nature. V'shachat bo shchitas psula. I mean, these are all things that are in their natural state, and they're mechubar. That's called mechubar meikara. And in the case of mechubar meikara, shchitas psula. And that's what the Gemara says here on the top of Daf Tes Zayin. Kashin adodi. Elav shmamino shiny ve'mechubi v'kar l'tol sof chibro shmamino. So when the price is said that even though, right, that because it's mechubar, the shchita is possible, that's going to be a case where it was originally attached to the ground. Like you have a rock protruding from the wall and it's sharp and you use it for shchita. That's possible. But tolush of self chibro, right? You had a knife and then you attached it to the wall, is then the shchita's kshera because it is considered tolush, not like it was before you did a chibur. And shmam, that's the final conclusion. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop with Omar Mar on Daf Tezayin. And that's the end of the 6th week of the Omer.